Mrs. Rosey Posey and the Fine China Plate. Right in the middle of Poppyville, at the end of Mary Lane, stands a big yellow house. Mrs. Rosey Posey lives here. Children love Mrs. Rosey Posey. One sunny day, Natalie came over. She sat on the steps and didn't play. Mrs. Rosey Posey said, "Mercy me, what is the matter?" "It's not fair," said Natalie. "All my friends went to a movie." "Why didn't you go?" asked Mrs. Rosey Posey. "My mom and dad said I couldn't go. They said it's not the kind of movie I should see," said Natalie. "Mercy me, you're right," said Mrs. Rosey Posey. "That isn't fair to your friends." "Not fair to them?" said Natalie. "What about me?" Mrs. Rosey Posey smiled. "Natalie, you have been set apart." "Set apart?" asked Natalie. "What does that mean?" "Come with me and I'll show you," said Mrs. Rosey Posey. They went into the kitchen. Mrs. Rosey Posey took out a bowl of cherries dipped in chocolate. "Yum," said Natalie. "Would you like some?" Mrs. Rosey Posey asked. "Oh, yes, please," said Natalie. Mrs. Rosey Posey went to the trash. She found a dirty paper plate. "Would you like your cherries on this plate?" she asked. "Is that the only plate you have?" asked Natalie. "Oh, no, I have other plates. Clean plates, special plates. Plates that I have set apart," said Mrs. Rosey Posey. Mrs. Rosey Posey held up a fine china plate with blue trim. "This plate is beautiful," said Natalie. "Yes, it is," said Mrs. Rosey Posey. "Which plate would you like to use?" Natalie chose the fine china plate. Mrs. Rosey Posey said, "I have kept this plate set apart. Now it is clean and ready." Mrs. Rosey Posey put chocolate cherries on it. Then she served Natalie. "You are like this china plate," said Mrs. Rosey Posey. "You are set apart. Your parents are helping you make good choices. These choices keep you clean inside." "Is that why they said I couldn't go to the movie?" asked Natalie. "Indeed," said Mrs. Rosey Posey. "Your parents love you very much, and so do I." Mrs. Rosey Posey smiled. Her eyes had a twinkle. Her smile had a zing. Mrs. Rosey Posey had a secret. "Natalie, what kind of plate would you like to be?" "I would like to be a fine china plate," said Natalie. Mrs. Rosey Posey wrote on the back of the fine china plate. She gave the plate to Natalie. "Is this for me? Thank you." "What does this Bible verse say?" asked Natalie. "It says if you stay away from sin, you will be like a plate made of pure gold. Then Jesus can use you for his important work." "Wow," Natalie said. "You mean the secret of the china plate is in the Bible?" "Of course," Mrs. Rosey Posey said. "That's where I get all my secrets." Natalie hugged Mrs. Rosey Posey. "You make me feel so special." "You are special, Natalie. You have been set apart, just like a fine china plate." I hope you enjoyed the story. Mimi loves you.